In the heart of Manhattan, a man who once had everything, wealth, power, family, lost it all, his wife to illness, his daughter to tragedy. Years later, on the banks of the Hudson River, fate placed a newborn in his arms, her fragile heartbeat fading fast. At Columbia Hospital, as the monitor flatlined, he begged the heavens for one more chance, and when her tiny chest rose again, he swore never to fail another child. From secret scandals to the courtroom of Manhattan, from whispers of power to the cry of Papa, this is the story of how love rewrites what loss once erased. Subscribe now and witness a family reborn. What if the life you couldn't save came back to you in the cry of a stranger's child? Would you walk away, or would you finally choose to hold on? Jonathan Hale had once been a man whose name was carved into the skyline of New York. Hale Capitol gleamed from a tower near Central Park, its glass walls reflecting the restless energy of Manhattan. At 42, Jonathan had everything people envied: wealth, influence, and the kind of voice in boardrooms that could tilt markets with a single sentence. But what no one saw, what he carefully hid behind tailored suits and headlines, was the void that had consumed him for years. He lived in a penthouse above the city, yet his home was quieter than any empty chapel. No laughter echoed down its marble halls. No footsteps danced across the hardwood floors. Just silence. A silence that had been born 5 years ago when Emily, his wife, succumbed to cancer after a brutal battle. He had promised her he would be strong for their daughter, Clara. And for a while he was. Clara had been his anchor, the one force pulling him away from despair. But fate, merciless in its timing, struck again. It was an autumn morning, the kind that draped New York in a crisp breeze and a chorus of taxi horns. Jonathan had left early for a board meeting. Clara, 12 years old, a violin case slung across her back, walked alone to the bus stop on West End Avenue. She had tied her shoelaces in haste, hair flying, her sneakers pounding the pavement. The SUV came out of nowhere. Brakes screamed, people shouted, but by the time the world stilled, Clara's small frame was crumpled against the asphalt. Jonathan never forgot the phone call that dragged him out of the meeting, nor the sprint through hospital corridors, his lungs burning with panic. At Columbia Hospital, he found her shoes, white sneakers, placed on a metal tray, and her hand, cold, motionless, as machines gave their futile beeps. Doctors shook their heads. There were no miracles left that night. "Papa's here," he whispered, tears falling onto her skin. "Papa's sorry. I was late." That moment carved itself into his soul, and for the next 2 years Jonathan lived not as a man but as a shadow. He buried himself in contracts, mergers, and quarterly reports. The world saw a tireless CEO. Only he knew the truth. He was a father with nothing left to protect. On a late November afternoon, the Hudson River stretched out like a strip of tarnished silver beneath a sky bruised by clouds. Jonathan walked its banks, hands in his coat pockets, head bowed against the wind. He often came here when the loneliness grew unbearable. The river carried away voices, memories, regrets. At least, that was what he told himself. But today, something broke through the wind's howl. A sound, soft, desperate. A whimper that didn't belong to the rustling trees or the river's current. He stopped. At first he thought it was his mind betraying him again, replaying Clara's last words in some cruel echo. But then he heard it again, thin, wavering, fragile. A cry. His eyes darted around until they fell on a duffel bag, abandoned near a bench by the water. It was dark green, zipped only halfway. The sound came from within. Jonathan's pulse surged. He dropped to his knees, hands trembling as he pulled the zipper. Inside, wrapped in a faded blanket, was a newborn girl. Her tiny face was pale, lips tinged blue, breath shallow as frost. She stirred, eyelids fluttering, and from her mouth came a whisper so faint Jonathan thought he'd imagined it. "Mama." The word cut through him like a blade. He staggered, nearly dropping the child, but then instinct, something long buried, rose up. He pressed her against his chest, feeling the fragile beat of her heart, weaker than any violin string he had ever heard. Clara's face flashed before his eyes, her last smile, her small hand slipping from his. "No," he choked, tightening his hold. "Not again. Not another one." Jonathan had once failed to arrive in time. He had once walked into Columbia Hospital too late to save his daughter. He would not make the same mistake. The streets blurred as he ran. Manhattan, with its endless rush of cars and voices, bent around his desperation. A man in a $1,000 coat, sprinting with a baby in his arms, was not a sight the city saw often. People turned, gasped, but Jonathan didn't stop. Every second mattered. He reached the taxi line, yanked open a door, and shouted, "Columbia Hospital now!" The driver's eyes widened at the sight of the infant, but without a word he pressed the pedal. Sirens wailed in Jonathan's memory, the ones that had followed Clara's ambulance. He pressed his lips to the baby's forehead, whispering frantic prayers he hadn't spoken in years. "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." As the cab swerved uptown, Jonathan's mind fractured between past and present. He saw the sterile corridors of Columbia, the nurses' whispers, the cold tray with shoes. He saw Clara's last violin lesson, the way she had promised she'd play for him after school. He heard her laugh, high and unbroken, before it was silenced forever. The baby whimpered again, chest heaving, then fell frighteningly still. "No!" Jonathan roared, shaking her gently. "Don't you leave me!" By the time they reached the hospital's emergency entrance, Jonathan's hair was damp with sweat, his breath ragged. He burst through the doors, shouting for help. Nurses rushed forward, one of them seizing the baby, another pulling Jonathan toward triage. "She stopped breathing!" he cried, collapsing to his knees on the cold tiles. "Please, please don't let her die." Machines hummed. A crash cart was wheeled in. Doctors barked orders. Jonathan's vision tunneled, the world narrowing to the small body on the gurney. He clasped his hands, the same way he had the night Clara slipped away. But this time, he shouted instead of whispering. "Not again. Please, not again." The defibrillator paddles pressed against the child's chest. "Clear!" a doctor shouted. A surge of electricity arced. The baby's body jerked. Jonathan's heart stopped with her stillness. "Again! Clear!" Another surge. The monitor blipped, flatlined, then a faint beat, a fragile spike of life. The room exhaled as one. Nurses steadied their hands, oxygen hissed through a mask, and Jonathan, shaking, let out a sob that clawed free after years of silence. She was alive. For now, she was alive. Jonathan leaned against the wall outside the room, chest heaving. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. Not the cold emptiness that had ruled him since Clara's death, but a fierce, burning determination. He stared through the window at the small form beneath the fluorescent light. She wasn't his daughter. She wasn't Clara. But she was a life. A fragile, precious life that fate had tossed into his path like a final test. Jonathan Hale had built empires. He had spoken to senators, bankers, kings of industry. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the promise forming inside him, stronger than any contract he had ever signed. This time, he would not be late. This time, he would hold on. And he whispered into the sterile air, almost as if speaking to Clara beyond the veil, "I won't fail her. Not like I failed you." The ambulance lights flickered against the wet pavement of Manhattan, but Jonathan Hale refused to step inside. He had chosen the back seat of a yellow cab instead, his arm still wrapped around the infant whose heartbeat had just stuttered back to life under the hands of strangers. Ambulances had carried Clara once. They had promised speed, technology, sirens that split the air with urgency. But sirens hadn't saved her. He couldn't bear the sound again. The driver's voice trembled in the mirror. "Sir, are you sure?" "Shouldn't." "Drive," Jonathan barked. His tone was less command than plea. The man pressed his foot to the accelerator, and the cab leapt forward, swallowed by Broadway's chaos. The baby's breaths came shallow and uneven, each rise and fall of her chest like a fragile thread threatening to snap. Jonathan pressed his cheek to her forehead. Her skin burned cold, not with fever but with the absence of warmth itself. He thought of Clara again, her violin case bouncing against her back, her smile in the morning sun, and his chest constricted. "Not you," he whispered, his words raw. "Not this time." The city blurred around him. Neon lights smeared against rain-streaked glass. Horns erupted in fury as the cab weaved through traffic. Somewhere above, electronic billboards flashed stock prices that once consumed Jonathan's every breath. Now, the Dow could crash into ashes for all he cared. All that mattered was the tiny weight in his arms. The closer they came to Washington Heights, the louder his memories screamed. Columbia University Medical Center. He knew its halls, its sterile brightness, the smell of antiseptic that clung to grief like a cruel perfume. It was the place where his world had collapsed 2 years ago. That night replayed in his mind without mercy. Clara on the gurney. Doctors rushing, voices sharp but hopeless. His hands pressed to hers, begging for warmth that never returned. And those sneakers, her white sneakers, set aside like an afterthought, as if the world had already moved on while he still stood drowning. He clenched the baby tighter. "You won't end like she did," he muttered, his teeth gritted against the sob clawing his throat. The driver swerved hard around a bus, earning a rain of curses from pedestrians. "Almost there, sir," he shouted. "Faster!" The baby stirred weakly at his voice. Her eyelids fluttered, lips forming a ghostly shape. Jonathan leaned close, straining to hear. "Mama." His heart broke open. The word had once been Clara's last cry in the hospital bed, reaching for Emily who was already gone. Now, spoken by this stranger's child, it ripped through time itself. Jonathan rocked her, whispering, "I know, sweetheart, I know. She's not here, but I am. I am." The cab screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance of Columbia. Jonathan shoved a handful of bills through the partition without looking, then barreled through the sliding doors. "Help!" His shout shattered the waiting room's routine hum. "She's not breathing again!" Doctors and nurses rushed forward. A young resident, hair tied back, reached for the child, but Jonathan recoiled. "No, I'm coming with her." "Sir, we need space." "I lost my daughter here once," Jonathan rasped. "I won't let another child go without me standing by." Something in his eyes, an abyss carved by grief, stilled the nurses' protest. They let him follow as the baby was placed on a gurney, tubes snaking, monitors beeping erratically. Inside the trauma bay, the scene mirrored his nightmare. Machines hummed. Gloves snapped. A crash cart stood ready. Jonathan gripped the bedrail so hard his knuckles blanched, his body trembling with the weight of déjà vu. The attending physician glanced up. "Sir, step back." Jonathan shook his head. "Just don't stop." The baby's chest went still. The monitor flatlined. The air froze. "Starting compressions," a nurse announced. Tiny chest, fragile ribs. Jonathan winced with every push. The doctor shouted, "Charge to 20 joules!" The paddles pressed against the child's skin. Clear! Jonathan flinched as electricity jolted her body. The monitor flickered, then flatlined again. Again! 30 joules! Clear! Another surge. Another silence. Jonathan's vision blurred with tears, his knees threatening to give way. Come on, he pleaded. Don't let her go. And then, a blip, a hesitant beep, then another. The monitor drew a fragile rhythm across its screen. The room exhaled in unison. She's back, the doctor confirmed, voice steady but urgent. Weak pulse, but we've got her. Jonathan collapsed into a chair, face buried in his hands. His sobs tore free, harsh and unrestrained. Nurses pretended not to notice. Doctors continued their work with efficient hands, but even they softened for a moment. The baby's chest rose and fell, small but steady. Life had returned. Hours later, Jonathan sat outside the ICU, shoulders hunched. His coat lay discarded across the chair, damp from the river air. His hands were clasped, not in prayer. He no longer knew how to pray, but in something close. He remembered every word Clara had whispered on her last day, her request that he come to her school concert, his promise to leave work early, the promise he had broken. He had arrived at the hospital instead of the auditorium. And now, for the first time, he wondered if this child had been given to him not by chance, but by some unseen mercy. A second chance disguised as a test. The automatic doors hissed open. A familiar smell of coffee and rain drifted in. He raised his eyes and froze. It was the same hallway, the same vending machine against the wall, the same sterile light. He had walked it once, as a father who lost everything. Now he walked it again with something, someone, in his grasp. A nurse stepped out of the ICU. She's stable for now, she said quietly, but she'll need constant monitoring. Her body temperature was dangerously low and she's severely dehydrated. We've started IV fluids. We'll need to run tests. Jonathan stood slowly. His voice cracked. Can I see her? The nurse hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the baby lay beneath warmers, tubes taped to her arms, a monitor tracing her fragile heartbeat. Her tiny fists opened and closed, reaching toward nothing. Jonathan placed a hand gently near hers, careful not to disturb the wires. She turned her head faintly as though sensing him, and for a moment he saw Clara again. The same vulnerability, the same plea for someone to stay. I'm here, Jonathan whispered, his throat raw. I won't leave you. Not this time. He stayed there long after midnight, refusing to go home, refusing to eat. He watched the monitor, each beep a fragile anchor pulling him back to life. At one point, a nurse draped a blanket over his shoulders. She's lucky you found her, she murmured. Jonathan gave a hollow laugh. Or maybe I was the one who needed saving. And for the first time in years, as the lights of Manhattan twinkled beyond the hospital windows, Jonathan allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the world had not finished with him yet. The quiet of the ICU was unlike any silence Jonathan had ever known. It was not the stillness of loss. He knew that silence too well, but the fragile hush of suspended hope. Machines hummed softly around the newborn, their screens glowing with gentle pulses of light, as if life itself was flickering in a fragile dance. Jonathan sat beside the incubator, his large frame folded into a chair too small for him, his eyes never leaving the child. She was nameless still, an abandoned stranger placed in his arms by fate. Yet in every twitch of her fingers, in every faint stir of her chest, he felt Clara's presence. It terrified him. It anchored him. It pulled him into a promise he hadn't chosen, but could no longer ignore. Hours blurred into one another. Jonathan remained in the same chair, exhausted but unwilling to surrender to sleep. At intervals, doctors entered with clipped voices, adjusting monitors, scribbling notes, speaking in a language of medicine that left him stranded between dread and relief. Then came a voice that didn't belong to the sterile world of medicine at all. "Excuse me, do you need help with her?" Jonathan looked up sharply. A woman stood at the doorway. She was not dressed in scrubs. No badge hung around her neck. Her coat was rain-streaked, her hair tucked loosely behind her ears. She held a folder of sheet music pressed against her chest, as though she had been clutching it long before she arrived here. Her eyes, hazel, quiet, wounded, were fixed not on him, but on the baby. Jonathan frowned. "Who are you?" "I'm Grace Miller," she replied softly. "I teach music at a public school in Queens. I was here earlier tonight for a volunteer recital in the children's wing. On my way out, one of the nurses told me about the baby." Her voice trembled on that word. Baby. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "And you came here? Why?" Grace hesitated, then stepped closer, her arms tightening around the folder as if shielding herself. "Because sometimes children don't respond to doctors first. Sometimes they need a hand, a voice, something familiar to hold on to." Jonathan stiffened. "She's not your responsibility." "Maybe not," Grace said. "But she's not yours either. Yet you're here." The words stung. Jonathan turned back to the incubator, unwilling to let a stranger pry into wounds she couldn't possibly understand. But then the baby stirred, her fists opening and closing in restless search. A thin cry escaped her lips, weak but insistent. Grace moved instinctively, her steps slow and reverent. She set her music folder aside and reached through the small opening in the incubator. Her fingers brushed the baby's hand, and at once the child's crying softened, her grip tightening around Grace's finger. Jonathan's breath caught. "She needs to feel someone near," Grace whispered. "She needs to know she's not alone." For the first time in years, Jonathan found himself at a loss for words. Later, in the small waiting lounge, Jonathan confronted her again. "Why are you really here?" His voice was sharper now, protective. "People don't wander into ICUs just to hold a stranger's hand." Grace looked down at her folded hands. Her silence stretched so long Jonathan almost rose to leave. Then she said, 2 years ago, I lost my daughter." Jonathan froze. "She was 6, Grace continued, her words trembling but clear. "A fever. It rose too quickly. By the time we reached the hospital, she was gone. I never got to say goodbye." She swallowed hard, blinking against tears that refused to fall. "I still hear her calling me sometimes. Still dream of holding her. And when I saw that little girl tonight, something inside me couldn't walk away." The rawness in her voice silenced Jonathan's doubts. Grief recognized grief. It was as if the air between them shifted, heavy with invisible threads of shared loss. He sank back into his chair, his voice rough. "I lost mine too. Clara. She was 12, hit by a car on her way to school." Grace's hand rose to her lips. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't change it," Jonathan muttered, but his tone lacked bitterness. It was weary instead, worn by years of carrying too much sorrow alone. Grace studied him quietly. "Then maybe this child, maybe she's not just another wound. Maybe she's something different." Jonathan shook his head, yet deep inside her words unsettled him. Over the next day, Grace did not leave. She asked no permission, sought no recognition. She simply stayed. When the baby whimpered, she was there, humming lullabies under her breath. songs Jonathan barely recognized but felt sinking into his bones. When nurses bustled with charts and tubes, Grace's presence was steady, offering the kind of gentleness no machine could replicate. Jonathan, awkward and unskilled, tried to learn from her. He clutched the bottle too stiffly when the nurse instructed him to feed. The infant sputtered and cried until Grace guided his hands with her own, showing him how to tilt just enough, how to pause so the child could breathe. "You're holding her like a contract," she teased softly. "Too firm, too cold." Jonathan almost bristled, but then the baby latched, drinking weakly, and he felt something stir in his chest, something terrifying, something alive. "She trusts you," Grace said gently. Jonathan stared at the child, her tiny mouth against the bottle, and whispered, "Why would she trust me? I don't even trust myself anymore." Grace didn't answer. She only smiled, the kind of smile that carried its own grief yet still reached for light. That evening, as fluorescent lights dimmed to a softer glow, Jonathan watched Grace cradle the baby. The child stirred, lips forming that one fragile word again. "Mama." Grace's eyes widened. Her arms tightened instinctively. Jonathan felt the air in the room shift, heavy with echoes of lives lost and bonds found. Grace blinked rapidly, tears welling. She called me Mama." Jonathan pressed a hand against his chest. He had spent years building walls of steel around himself. Tonight, in a hospital room with a stranger and an abandoned child, those walls cracked. "Maybe she sees something we don't yet," he murmured. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The baby's breathing steadied between them, a fragile tether binding 3 broken lives into one fragile moment of hope. Morning light crept slowly into the hospital room, softening the sterile walls with a wash of gold. For Jonathan Hale, it was the first dawn in years that didn't feel entirely hollow. He had sat through the night in the same chair, his body aching, his mind restless, but his eyes never strayed far from the tiny figure swaddled in white. The child's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm now, fragile yet stubborn. Machines traced her heartbeat, but it was not the monitors Jonathan relied on. It was the faint warmth of her hand against his palm. Every so often she would grip his finger as if reminding him she was still here. Each grasp was like an anchor pulling him back from the abyss of his own grief. Grace Miller had returned just before dawn, her coat folded neatly over her arm, her face weary yet softened by determination. She carried with her not only the quiet patience of a teacher, but the ache of a mother who still longed for a daughter lost too soon. Together, they hovered near the crib, silent witnesses to a fragile miracle. By mid-morning, the nurses insisted that the baby would need consistent caretakers if she survived. "She can't remain anonymous," one said gently, clipboard in hand. "If she was abandoned, social services will intervene. She'll be placed into the system unless—" The nurse's eyes flickered toward Jonathan, then toward Grace. "Unless what?" Jonathan asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Unless someone steps forward," the nurse replied, her tone careful. "Even temporarily. For medical consent. For decisions about her care. For love." The word lodged itself in Jonathan's chest like an arrow. After the nurse left, the room settled into silence again. Grace stood near the window, her gaze on the Hudson River glimmering in the distance. Jonathan leaned against the crib, one hand resting gently near the baby. "We can't just call her the baby," Grace murmured. Jonathan turned. "What else would you suggest?" "She needs a name," Grace said softly. "Something that tells her she belongs in this world, no matter how she came into it." Jonathan's throat tightened. Names don't change what the world will do to her. Grace walked closer, her eyes steady. "Maybe not," but names can change what we choose to do for her. The baby stirred at that moment, a small whimper escaping her lips. Jonathan bent low, brushing his thumb across her cheek. He remembered another morning long ago, Clara tying her shoelaces at the kitchen table, promising she would play her violin for him after school. He had kissed the top of her head distractedly, his mind already in the day's agenda. He had thought there would be endless mornings. He swallowed hard. When Clara was little, she asked me once why we chose her name. I told her it meant bright, clear, shining. She liked that. She said it was proof she was meant to light up the world. And she did. For 12 years, she did. His voice faltered. Grace placed a gentle hand on his arm, not to interrupt, but to steady him. Jonathan's gaze fell back to the newborn. Her tiny chest rose, stubborn against the world. If I give her a name, it can't be out of sentiment. It has to be a vow. Grace whispered, "Then let it be a vow." They stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down like sacred ground. Finally, Jonathan spoke, his voice low, trembling. "Hope." Grace's eyes softened. "Hope. She'll carry what I couldn't give Clara. Not certainty, not protection from the world, but hope. Hope that she will live, that she will be loved, that she will never be left behind again." His throat tightened. "Hope Hale." The baby let out a soft sigh as if accepting the gift. Grace blinked back tears. "It's perfect." The hours that followed were filled with small acts that felt monumental. Jonathan, who had spent his life commanding boardrooms and managing billion-dollar investments, now struggled with the mechanics of mixing formula. His first attempt left the bottle clumped and uneven. Grace chuckled softly. "You're stirring it like a hostile takeover. Gentle, steady. Hostile takeovers I understand," Jonathan muttered, frowning at the stubborn powder. "Bottles, apparently not. Here." Grace guided his hands, her touch light but confident. She showed him how to swirl the bottle, how to test the warmth on his wrist. Jonathan felt foolish, but when the baby latched and drank without protest, his chest tightened with unexpected pride. Later, he tried changing her diaper. The task proved comically disastrous. The tabs tore, the wipes stuck to his fingers, and by the time he managed to fasten it, Grace was laughing outright. "You close billion-dollar deals," she teased. "And you're defeated by a diaper." Jonathan shook his head, but a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Don't tell anyone. The markets would collapse." Grace's laughter softened into something tender. "She doesn't care who you are, Jonathan. She just cares that you're here." Jonathan glanced down at Hope, her tiny face relaxed in sleep. The truth of Grace's words hit harder than any headline ever could. That evening, the room grew quiet again. Outside, the city's roar dimmed into a low hum. Jonathan sat beside the crib, Grace across from him, the two of them bound together by exhaustion and something deeper they dared not name. Hope stirred in her sleep, lips parting. "Mama," she murmured faintly. Grace froze, her eyes filling instantly with tears. She reached out, pressing a trembling hand against her mouth. Jonathan felt his own breath catch. The word echoed like a bell across the years. Clara had once called out the same word on her hospital bed, reaching for a mother who was already gone. Now, this abandoned child, nameless until today, had spoken it to Grace. Grace's tears slipped free, unashamed. She bent close, her whisper unsteady. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Jonathan turned away, his own tears burning. He had thought he was beyond crying. That grief had dried his soul into dust. But tonight, he wept. Not only for Clara, not only for Emily, but for the strange, unexpected grace that had walked into this hospital room and dared to cradle hope again. The news did not remain inside the walls of Columbia Hospital for long. In New York, whispers traveled faster than the subway. Jonathan Hale's absence from the Hale Capitol Tower had already triggered murmurs. Investors noticed when a man like him disappeared from the thrum of Wall Street. And when a photograph leaked, Jonathan leaving the hospital in a rain-soaked coat, a newborn bundled in his arms, the city's rumor mill ignited like a flare. By Monday morning, the boardroom of Hale Capital was a hive of unease. The long table gleamed with polished walnut, the skyline of lower Manhattan stretching behind the glass. Men and women in tailored suits shuffled papers they had already read 3 times. Eyes darted toward the door, toward one another, toward the headlines on their phones. "Is it true?" one whispered. "They say he found the child abandoned by the river." "A publicity stunt?" another muttered. "No. He hasn't left the hospital in days. It's unsettling." The air thickened with speculation. To the markets, uncertainty was poison, and Jonathan Hale's name was synonymous with stability. Until now. The door opened. Jonathan stepped in. He looked nothing like the immaculate commander they were accustomed to. His suit was pressed, yes, but his tie hung slightly loose, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Most startling of all, his phone was silent in his pocket. For years, he had entered boardrooms with 3 devices buzzing, an assistant trailing close behind. Today, he came alone. The whispers died into silence. "Good morning," Jonathan said, his voice calm but steely. He took his seat at the head of the table. "I'm told there are concerns." The CFO cleared his throat. "Concerns, yes. Jonathan, the press is circling. Your photograph with the child. It's everywhere. Our stock dipped 3% overnight." Jonathan folded his hands, unmoved. "Stocks recover." "With respect," the CFO pressed, "Wall Street doesn't reward unpredictability. Investors are asking questions. Who is the baby? Why were you at Columbia? Are you prepared for the liability if the media twists this into something else?" Jonathan's gaze swept the table. "Let them ask." A director leaned forward, her tone sharp. "Jonathan, philanthropy is one thing. But taking in a child off the streets, without protocol, without clarity, do you realize the scandal this could become? The board cannot afford erratic behavior." Erratic. The word hung heavy. For years, Jonathan had been the embodiment of control. Now, in their eyes, he looked like a man untethered. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He thought of Clara's last morning, her violin case swinging at her side. He thought of the cold metal tray with her shoes. He thought of Hope's fragile heartbeat steadying beneath the machines, her tiny fingers curling around his. He rose to his feet. "If your concern is profit margins," Jonathan said quietly, "then perhaps I am the wrong man to lead this company." The room stiffened. He continued, his voice gaining force. "I found a child abandoned by the Hudson River. She would have died in my arms if I hadn't taken her to Columbia. If you consider that scandalous, then scandal will be my legacy. If saving a life costs me this chair—" He gestured to the leather seat at the head of the table. "Then find another man to fill it." Silence pressed against the glass walls. Some averted their eyes. Others stared, shaken by the rare sight of Jonathan Hale speaking not as a strategist, but as a father. The general counsel cleared his throat nervously. "Jonathan, please, no one is questioning your humanity. We are questioning the risk." Jonathan leaned forward, palms flat on the table. The greatest risk I ever took was believing there would always be time. Time for one more meeting. Time for one more call before coming home. Time to see my daughter's recital. And when I was wrong, when time ran out, I buried Clara instead. I will not make that mistake again. The silence that followed was absolute. After the meeting dissolved in uneasy quiet, Jonathan returned to his penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city sprawled beneath him, lights flickering like restless constellations. He set his briefcase aside, but his eyes drifted toward the nursery where Hope now slept under Grace's careful watch. Grace met him at the doorway. "How was it?" she asked softly. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "The board believes compassion is a liability." Grace studied him. "And what do you believe?" Jonathan glanced at Hope's crib. Her tiny breaths were steady, her hand curled near her face. "I believe they've forgotten that money isn't the only thing that compounds. Choices do, too. I chose wrong once. I won't again." Grace's lips curved into a quiet smile. "Then she's already changed you." Jonathan turned toward her, the weight of the day pressing on him. "You don't understand. They'll come after me, Grace. The board, the shareholders, even the press. They'll say I've lost focus, that I'm weak." Grace shook her head. "Weak? No. What you did takes more strength than any boardroom power play." She touched the edge of the crib, her fingers gentle. "Don't mistake kindness for weakness. The world already has enough cold men with full pockets. It needs men who remember how to care." Jonathan looked at her then, really looked. He saw not just a teacher who had wandered into his life, but a woman who bore her own scars and still chose gentleness over bitterness. And for the first time in years, he wondered if perhaps strength had never been about numbers, or titles, or towers of glass, but about the courage to kneel by a crib and whisper promises to a child who had nothing else. The next morning, headlines blared across the city. "Hale Capital CEO defies board, chooses baby over business." "Jonathan Hale's mysterious child, PR disaster or redemption story." Reporters gathered outside his building, microphones poised, cameras flashing. Jonathan ignored them, carrying Hope close to his chest, Grace at his side. For once, he did not feel the need to answer the questions hurled at him. His answer lay in the heartbeat he could feel beneath the blanket. Snow had begun to fall on Manhattan, blanketing the avenues in a fragile quiet. Jonathan's penthouse, usually a fortress of solitude, now carried unfamiliar sounds: the soft cooing of an infant, the rustle of blankets, the faint hum of a lullaby sung by Grace Miller. Hope's presence had rewritten the air itself. What once echoed with emptiness now pulsed with tentative life. Jonathan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his hands folded behind his back. The city sparkled below him like a restless ocean of lights. In the nursery, Grace sat in the rocking chair, cradling Hope as she drifted toward sleep. It might have looked like a portrait of peace, but Jonathan knew storms brewed beyond the glass walls. The boardroom had been only the first battle. The press was circling like hawks, and investors were whispering about instability. Yet Jonathan did not waver. Hope had awakened something in him he thought long dead, a resolve that no quarterly report could diminish. Still, he sensed that the story of this child was larger than what he had been told. Abandonment by the river felt too cruel, too deliberate. And that night, his suspicion was confirmed. The elevator chimed. His housekeeper, Maria Alvarez, stepped into the penthouse. She had worked for Jonathan's family since Clara was born, a quiet, steady presence who had seen him through grief and solitude. Tonight, however, her eyes betrayed something more than weariness. Mr. Hale, Maria said softly, wringing her hands, may I speak with you privately? Jonathan turned from the window, his brow furrowing. Of course. Is something wrong? Maria hesitated, glancing toward the nursery where Grace now hummed to Hope. She lowered her voice. It's about the baby. Jonathan's chest tightened. What about her? Maria's gaze dropped to the floor. For years, she had spoken to him with ease, but tonight her voice cracked. I know who she is. Jonathan stiffened. What are you saying? Maria's eyes brimmed with guilt. She is not just some child left behind in the cold. She is the daughter of Rebecca Thompson. Jonathan froze. The name was familiar, too familiar. Rebecca Thompson, the 20-year-old daughter of Senator Charles Thompson, a man whose grip on Washington politics was legendary and ruthless. Maria's voice shook as she continued. I was hired months ago by the Thompson family to help around their estate in upstate New York. That's when I met Rebecca. She was pregnant, frightened, desperate to keep it hidden from her father. She trusted me with her secret. Jonathan's throat tightened. And the baby's father? Maria shook her head. She never said. Only that Senator Thompson would destroy her if the world knew. He wanted her focused on her political future, not weighed down by scandal. When the baby was born, Charles ordered her taken away. Jonathan's fists clenched at his sides. Taken away? Her voice broke. Yes. He instructed his aides to pay someone to abandon her, anywhere the press wouldn't trace it back. I begged Rebecca to fight him. She cried. She begged me to protect the child. And when I saw the photograph of you carrying the baby into Columbia, I knew it was her. Jonathan's pulse hammered. The icy chill that swept over him was not from the winter night outside, but from the realization of the forces arrayed against them. You're telling me, he said slowly, that Hope was discarded, not by chance, not by poverty, but as a calculated decision to hide a senator's scandal? Maria nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, Mr. Hale. I should have come sooner. I thought maybe she was already gone. I couldn't bear to speak of it until I knew she was safe. Jonathan turned away, gripping the window ledge with white knuckles. Rage boiled beneath his grief, cold and sharp. A senator, a man entrusted with power, had nearly condemned this child to die in the dark, because of politics, because of reputation. Behind him, Maria whispered, Rebecca loved her baby. She was too weak to fight her father then, but I know she still does. Jonathan closed his eyes. Hope's tiny face flashed before him. Clara's memory lingered beside it. He understood now. Saving this child meant standing not only against markets and shareholders, but against a machine far larger, far darker, politics, legacy, and the kind of power that crushed anything in its path. Grace appeared in the doorway, Hope asleep in her arms. What's going on? She asked softly, sensing the tension. Jonathan met her gaze. Hope has a family, but not the kind we would wish for her. Grace's brow furrowed. Who? Jonathan's voice hardened. She's the granddaughter of Senator Charles Thompson. Grace nearly gasped, clutching Hope closer. The Charles Thompson? He's untouchable. Not to me, Jonathan said coldly. His eyes burned with a fire Grace had never seen before. If he thinks he can throw away a life for his convenience, he's forgotten there are still men left who know what it means to protect. Grace stepped closer, her voice trembling. Jonathan, this isn't just business anymore. This is politics. He has power you can't imagine. Jonathan looked at Hope's sleeping face, her lips parted in fragile peace. He whispered, "Then he'll discover what kind of power a father can have when he refuses to lose another child." That night, long after Maria left, Jonathan stood over Hope's crib with Grace beside him. Snow fell thickly outside, muffling the city into silence. "She's not safe," Grace whispered. "If her grandfather wants her gone once, what's to stop him from trying again?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "He'll have to go through me." Grace touched his arm gently. "And if going through you means destroying everything you've built?" Jonathan turned to her, his eyes raw but steady. "Grace, I already lost everything once. My wife, my daughter, my peace. Do you really think I care about skyscrapers and stock prices now? Hope is worth more than all of it combined." Grace held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we fight. Together." For the first time since Clara's death, Jonathan did not feel alone in the battle ahead. He had Grace's strength, Maria's confession, and Hope's fragile heartbeat pulling him forward. And deep in his chest, beneath layers of grief and rage, burned a single truth. This was no longer about redemption. It was about justice. Snow had not yet melted from the avenues of Manhattan when Jonathan Hale's doorbell rang with a force that echoed through the penthouse like a verdict. Grace, who was cradling Hope near the fire, startled. Jonathan, standing at the window, stiffened before striding to the door. He knew before opening it who would be on the other side. When the door swung wide, Senator Charles Thompson stood there, flanked by two aides in immaculate suits. His presence filled the entryway with a chill sharper than the January wind. Behind him, Rebecca Thompson, barely 20, pale beneath her flawless makeup, clutched her gloves, eyes swollen as though she had been crying for hours. "Jonathan Hale," the senator's voice boomed, smooth but edged with iron. "We need to talk." Jonathan did not step aside. "This is my home." "And that," Thompson's eyes flicked toward the living room where Grace now stood protectively with the child in her arms, "is my granddaughter." The words hung in the air like thunder. Jonathan's voice was even. "She is not your possession." The senator brushed past him without waiting for permission. His aides followed, carrying briefcases stuffed with papers that reeked of legal threats. Rebecca trailed behind, her steps hesitant. In the living room, Thompson turned sharply to Grace. "Put her down. You have no right to hold her." Grace's arms tightened instinctively. Hope stirred, whimpering, and pressed her tiny face against Grace's shoulder. "She doesn't want you," Grace whispered fiercely. The senator's nostrils flared. "She is blood. She is a Thompson. And she will be raised with the resources, the privilege, and the future that only our family can provide. Hand her over." Jonathan stepped between them, his voice low and dangerous. "You would have left her to die on the banks of the Hudson River." For the first time, Rebecca broke her silence. "Papa, please." Her voice cracked. "Don't do this. Don't lie." Thompson's jaw tightened. "Rebecca." But she pressed forward, tears spilling freely now. "I begged you. I begged you to let me keep her. And you said no. You said my career, your career was worth more than my child. You forced me." Her voice faltered into sobs. "You forced me to let her go." The senator turned scarlet, rage burning through his composure. "Enough!" His fist struck the mantel, rattling the picture frames. "Do you understand what is at stake? My career, our family's legacy, everything I've built, cannot be undone by a foolish mistake." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Your granddaughter is not a mistake. She is a life." Thompson swung toward him, his voice a bark. "If you persist in this delusion, If you keep this child under your roof, you will be destroyed. Your company, your reputation, your fortune, gone. I will see to it personally." Grace flinched at the venom in his words, but Jonathan did not waver. His voice was calm, steady, like a blade drawn across stone. "You think you can frighten me with ruin? I have already lost everything that matters. My wife, my daughter. Do you think skyscrapers and stock prices mean anything to me now? If protecting her costs me my empire, then take it. But you will not take her." Hope whimpered again, her small voice cutting through the storm of adult fury. She stretched out a hand from Grace's arms, not toward the senator, not even toward Rebecca, but toward Jonathan. Her lips formed a single trembling word. "Papa." The room fell silent. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, swallowing hard. When he opened them, his gaze was locked on Thompson's, unshakable. "You hear that? She has spoken for herself. She has chosen." Rebecca broke then. She fell to her knees, sobbing openly. "I'm sorry, Hope. I'm so sorry. I never wanted this." Her voice cracked as she turned to Jonathan. "Please, don't let him take her. If you must, call me anything. Monster, coward, but don't let him near her again." The aides shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to step in. Thompson's face had hardened into stone, his fury simmering beneath the surface. But even he could not erase the sound of that one fragile word echoing through the room. "Mama," Hope whispered then, clutching Grace's collar. Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. She kissed the child's forehead, rocking her gently. Jonathan straightened, his voice like iron. "Leave my home, Senator. If you wish to pursue this in court, then do so. But do not darken my door again with threats. Because I will not yield. Not to you. Not to anyone." The senator's jaw clenched. His aides closed their briefcases, their movements clipped. Rebecca rose shakily, wiping her tears, but she did not follow her father to the door. As Thompson stormed out, his voice carried back one last warning. "This is not over, Hale, not by a long shot." When the door slammed shut, the penthouse sank into stillness. Grace collapsed into the sofa, Hope clutched to her chest. Rebecca remained standing, trembling, her hands twisting in anguish. Jonathan crossed to her. "You should not have to choose between your father and your daughter, but I promise you this, Hope will be safe." Rebecca nodded, her tears falling silently. "I can't fight him, but you can. Please, let me at least see her sometimes. Let me be her aunt, if nothing else." Jonathan's expression softened. "We'll find a way." Grace looked up, her voice thick. She already knows who her parents are, but maybe she can have an aunt who loves her too. Rebecca covered her face with her hands and wept anew. Hope, nestled against Grace, sighed in her sleep, as if unaware of the storms that had raged around her. Jonathan stood over them, his resolve hardening. The senator's threats were real, his power immense. But for the first time in years, Jonathan felt no fear. He had stood against grief itself and survived. He could stand against Charles Thompson too, and this time he would not lose. The gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. Court is now in session. The marble-paneled courtroom on Center Street was filled to its edges. Reporters occupied the first 2 rows, their pens ready, cameras flashing as though history itself were about to be rewritten. Behind them sat curious citizens, drawn not only by the spectacle of a powerful senator, but by the sight of Jonathan Hale, a titan of finance, seated quietly at the defense table with a newborn child's life resting in the balance. At the opposite table, sat Senator Charles Thompson, his posture as rigid as the American flag behind him. His attorneys, polished and aggressive, stacked legal briefs like weapons of war. Next to them, Rebecca Thompson sat pale and silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. The judge, Honorable Samuel Parker, lifted his gaze. A man of measured words and keen eyes, he was known across New York for siding with neither politics nor money, but with law. And today the law was entangled with something greater, the fate of a child whose cries had shaken the city. The senator's attorney rose first. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Baby Thompson, born to Rebecca Thompson, daughter of Senator Charles Thompson, was abandoned without consent of her family. The senator seeks immediate custody of his granddaughter. Under New York state law, blood relatives hold primary rights of guardianship. It is our position that Mr. Hale, while well-intentioned, unlawfully removed the child from the scene and has no legal claim. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Jonathan's lawyer, a seasoned advocate named Daniel Klein, stood slowly. His salt-and-pepper hair and steady voice gave him the air of a man who had weathered storms greater than politics. Your Honor, Klein began, this is not a matter of paperwork or lineage. This is a matter of life and safety. This child, whom Mr. Hale has named Hope, was not misplaced. She was abandoned, left to die in a duffel bag by the Hudson River. And who, Your Honor, ordered that abandonment? Evidence will show it was the very man sitting before you, the child's grandfather, Senator Thompson. Gasps broke across the room. Thompson's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Klein pressed forward. We will show that Mr. Hale did not abduct a child. He saved her. And in the eyes of the law, there exists a doctrine far greater than bloodlines, the best interest of the child. We contend that this child's best interest is not in the hands of the man who sought her death, but in the arms of the man who carried her into life. The judge nodded, expression unreadable. Proceed. Testimony began. Nurses from Columbia Hospital recounted the night Jonathan arrived, frantic, clutching the newborn as she slipped toward death. One described how Jonathan refused to leave the trauma bay, begging the doctors to save her. Another testified that Hope's tiny hand clutched Grace Miller's finger as if refusing to let go. The senator's attorneys countered with cold logic. They presented birth records proving Hope was Rebecca's daughter, citing family rights statutes, and argued that whatever misunderstanding had occurred at the riverbank was immaterial. Family is family, they repeated, as though the phrase itself were armor. Rebecca was called next. The courtroom hushed as she took the stand. Her voice was trembling, but her words cut clear. My father ordered her abandoned, she confessed, her tears spilling freely. I begged him to let me keep her. I begged him to let me be a mother. He said no, that she was a threat to his career, to our name. He told me she would disappear, and the world would forget. But I could never forget. Senator Thompson slammed his palm against the table. Lies, he thundered. She is confused, misled. The judge's gavel struck sharply. Order! But the gallery erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Photographers' flashes captured the moment. A young woman weeping against her father's iron denial. Jonathan sat still. His fists clenched beneath the table. His heart ached for Rebecca's brokenness, but his eyes never left the crib at the back of the courtroom, where Hope slept under Grace's careful watch. Finally, Jonathan himself was called. He walked to the stand slowly, shoulders squared, his expression steady though his heart hammered. The oath rang in his ears as he sat. Mr. Hale, the attorney began, why did you take custody of this child? Jonathan's voice was low, rough with truth. Because she would have died if I didn't. Do you have any biological relation to her? No. Then why fight for her? Jonathan's gaze turned toward the jury. Because blood alone does not make a parent. Love does. Presence does. The willingness to protect, no matter the cost. That makes a parent. I buried my daughter 2 years ago because I thought I had more time. I will not bury another child because a man values his reputation more than her life. The courtroom fell silent. Mr. Hale, the attorney pressed, you are a billionaire CEO. You could have walked away, called the police, left this matter to the state. Why not? Jonathan's eyes burned. Because when I looked into her eyes, I saw my Clara. I saw every promise I failed to keep. And I knew if I walked away, I would never deserve another breath. So I chose to stay. And I will keep staying. For as long as she needs me. A murmur rose, not of gossip, but of quiet awe. Even the reporters lowered their pens, struck by the naked truth of his words. The day stretched into evening. Legal arguments tangled over statutes and precedents, over rights and responsibilities. Yet the heart of the case was no longer in the law books. It was in the quiet corner of the courtroom where hope slept, and in the steady conviction of the man who refused to abandon her. As closing arguments ended, Judge Parker looked over the rim of his glasses at the gallery. I will deliver my ruling tomorrow morning. Until then, the child will remain under temporary guardianship with Mr. Hale. The gavel fell. The session ended. But as people rose and gathered their coats, a small sound carried above the shuffle. Hope had woken. She rubbed her eyes, looked across the room, and, before cameras, reporters, lawyers, and her grandfather himself, she toddled on unsteady feet toward Jonathan. "Papa!" she cried, arms lifted. The courtroom froze. Jonathan bent, scooping her into his arms. His lips trembled as he pressed them against her hair, and for a moment, even Senator Thompson's fury could not break the silence that followed. The courthouse on Center Street was heavy with anticipation. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the city was blanketed in a rare stillness, as though even New York itself was waiting for Judge Samuel Parker's decision. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Reporters clutched notepads, cameras poised for the moment history would tip one way or another. On one side sat Senator Charles Thompson, his jaw clenched, his attorneys rigid as soldiers awaiting orders. On the other sat Jonathan Hale, his suit plain, his hands steady on the table before him, Grace by his side and Hope in her lap, asleep beneath a soft blanket. Rebecca Thompson sat behind them, her eyes red but resolute. The gavel struck. All rise. Judge Parker entered, robes sweeping as he settled onto the bench. He glanced at the clock, then at the packed room, and finally at the child who had unknowingly become the center of a national storm. You may be seated. The proceedings began with a tense review of closing arguments. Senator Thompson's attorneys reiterated lineage, family rights, and the supposed stability his household could provide. They painted Jonathan as reckless, a man whose grief clouded judgment, a CEO using a child as a salve for wounds he had never healed. But the testimony of Rebecca had shaken their case. Her confession of coercion, her plea for her daughter's safety, and her rejection of her father's power still hung in the air like an open wound. Jonathan's lawyer, Daniel Klein, rose one last time. His voice was measured, but his words carried weight. Your Honor, the law recognizes family by blood, but it also recognizes something greater, the best interest of the child. This is no abstract principle. It is the heart of family law in this country. What is best for Hope? To return to the man who sought her disappearance? Or to remain with the man who saved her, who has already given her the one thing every child deserves, love without condition? Klein's words faded into silence. The entire room turned to Judge Parker. The judge removed his glasses, polishing them with deliberate slowness. When he spoke, his voice was steady, each word deliberate. I have presided over custody disputes for more than 2 decades. I have heard every argument of lineage, wealth, and reputation. But I have also learned that a child's welfare cannot be measured by prestige or pedigree. It is measured by presence, by safety, by love. He looked directly at Senator Thompson. The evidence brought forth is clear. This court cannot ignore the testimony that you, Senator, acted to conceal your daughter's pregnancy and ordered that the child be abandoned. Such conduct disqualifies you from any claim to guardianship. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Thompson's face flushed crimson, but he did not speak. The judge continued. Rebecca Thompson has expressed remorse and a desire to remain part of her child's life. This court does not find her unfit, but given her age and circumstances, primary custody cannot be granted at this time. Finally, his gaze shifted to Jonathan. Mr. Hale, you are not related by blood, but family is not built only of blood. It is built of sacrifice, of nights spent at hospital bedsides, of promises made and kept, of love proven by action. This child, Hope, has already called you Papa, and in this court her voice matters. Jonathan's throat tightened. Grace squeezed his hand beneath the table. Judge Parker lifted his gavel. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that custody of the child, legally to be known as Hope Hale, is granted to Jonathan Hale, with Rebecca Thompson granted visitation rights as Aunt Rebecca, under terms to be determined. The gavel struck. For a moment, the courtroom held its breath. Then Rebecca sobbed openly, covering her face in her hands. Grace pressed Hope closer, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Jonathan bowed his head, overcome, his hand trembling as it covered his eyes. But the moment was not yet over. Rebecca rose slowly, her legs unsteady, and addressed the court. Your Honor, I know I failed my daughter once. I know I let fear silence me. But today I want to say, before all of you, that I will not fail her again. My father's power does not define me. My love for her will. She turned to Jonathan, tears shining in her eyes. If you will let me, I want to be her aunt. I want to love her from whatever distance the court allows. I don't deserve to be her mother now, but please don't shut me out. Jonathan's chest ached with the weight of her words. He rose, hope still in his arms, and walked to her. Rebecca, he said softly, you are not shut out. Hope deserves every bit of love she can get. If you can give her that, then there is a place for you in her life. Rebecca broke down, pressing her hands to her mouth. Hope stirred, blinking sleepily, and reached a tiny hand toward her. Rebecca kissed her daughter's fingers, whispering, I love you. As the courtroom emptied, Senator Thompson remained seated, his face carved in fury. His attorneys whispered frantically, but he ignored them. For the first time in his career, he had lost, not in the Senate, but in a court of family and truth. Jonathan passed him without a glance, hope held high against his chest. Grace walked beside him, Rebecca just behind. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions. But Jonathan didn't hear them. All he heard was the soft sound of Hope's breath against his neck, the word she had spoken days earlier echoing again in his mind. Papa. And this time, he knew he had not failed her. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell in the court of Manhattan. Spring had returned to New York, softening the city's harsh edges with blossoms along Riverside Drive and the glimmer of sun on the Hudson. For Jonathan Hale, The world no longer felt like a hollow corridor of grief. It pulsed again with the sound of life. The penthouse that once stood as a mausoleum to his losses was transformed. Toys lined the nursery shelves. A small violin rested in the corner, a gift Grace had purchased not for Clara, whose memory still lingered, but for the little girl who had become their heartbeat. Hope Hale now filled the rooms with her laughter, a sound Jonathan had thought he would never hear again. Grace had moved in quietly at first, helping with the child's needs, offering steady guidance to a man who knew how to broker billion-dollar deals, but not how to fasten a diaper. Over time, what began as necessity unfolded into something deeper. In the tender hours of dawn, when Hope stirred from sleep, Jonathan would find Grace already by her side, humming lullabies. And in the quiet of evenings, when Hope finally surrendered to dreams, Jonathan and Grace would sit together by the fire, not speaking of boardrooms or courtrooms, but of music, of memory, of second chances. One morning, Jonathan found himself kneeling in Riverside Church, the very place he and Emily had once spoken of renewing vows they never lived to keep. Now, he stood there not with grief alone, but with Grace by his side, Hope skipping ahead as the flower girl. The bells of Riverside tolled, the pews filled with family, friends, and even colleagues who had once doubted him, but now looked at him with newfound respect. The story of Jonathan Hale, the billionaire who risked his empire for an abandoned child, had spread beyond Wall Street into the hearts of ordinary people. Grace walked slowly down the aisle, her dress simple, elegant, luminous. She carried no jewels but the light in her eyes. When she reached Jonathan, he took her hand, steady and reverent. The officiant spoke words of covenant, but Jonathan barely heard. All he saw was Grace. All he felt was Hope tugging at his trouser leg, holding petals in her small hand. When it came time for vows, Jonathan's voice broke. I once thought family was something I could lose forever. But today, I know it can also be rewritten. Grace, you walked into my life when I was drowning in silence. You gave me a reason to breathe again. And Hope. His eyes drifted to the little girl beaming at them both. You gave me a reason to live again. I vow to love you both for all the days I have left. Grace's reply was soft but steady. I once thought music was the only way I could still touch my daughter's memory. But now I see music in every smile, every breath, every heartbeat we share. Jonathan, you gave me back courage. And together, we will give Hope the family she deserves. Tears streamed down more than a few faces in the pews. Even Rebecca, seated near the front, wept openly, a handkerchief pressed to her mouth. She had chosen to stand not as claimant or rival, but as Aunt Rebecca, humbled and grateful for a second chance to love without fear. When the rings were exchanged and the vows sealed, the bells of Riverside rang once more, declaring not just a marriage but the rebirth of a family. The reception afterward was held in the garden beside the church, where tulips bloomed and children laughed. Jonathan stood with Hope on his shoulders, Grace's hand entwined with his. For the first time in years, he felt Emily and Clara were not lost, but at peace, watching, smiling, perhaps even whispering their blessing on the wind. Rebecca approached hesitantly. She wore no mask of glamour today, only a simple dress and eyes still rimmed red. She looks happy, she whispered, nodding toward Hope, who was chasing bubbles across the lawn. Jonathan smiled. She is, and she will be. Rebecca swallowed hard. Thank you for letting me be part of her life. I don't deserve it. Grace touched her arm gently. We don't measure worth by what we've lost, Rebecca, only by how we choose to love now. Rebecca broke into tears, and Jonathan embraced her briefly. In that moment, the weight of politics and scandal felt far away. What remained was simply family. As twilight descended over Manhattan, Jonathan carried Hope onto the balcony of their home. The city stretched endlessly before them, glittering with life. Grace stood beside him, her arm looped through his. Hope leaned against his chest, eyes wide at the skyline. "Papa," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Is all this ours?" Jonathan's throat tightened. He looked at the city, not as conquest, but as gift, and then down at the small child in his arms. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "All this isn't ours. What's ours is right here." He pressed his lips to her hair, holding Grace's hand as the three of them stood against the vast horizon. For Jonathan Hale, the man who had lost everything, this was not a return to the past. It was something new, something rewritten, a family. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of Jonathan, Grace, and Little Hope's journey. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing so you'll never miss another healing tale of love, redemption, and family. Your presence here means more than words can say.